I just want to come in on that question of accommodation. I think it's utterly shameful that there's over 400 people sleeping on the streets, and probably that will escalate, while at the same time we see the obscenity of what's been going on in Mullingar. And people ask many questions of me and I can't answer them. How is Mullingar allowed to happen? That's the first question. How is it allowed that, you know, a tiny group of people can deprive others of their human rights and their civil rights? Number one. And secondly, why is it that we have so many empty buildings? Bagot Street Hospital, the Old Jury's Hotel in Ballsbridge, a plethora of religious institutions, including a big church in the city centre, that we can't take on, refurbish and use for accommodation for those unfortunates who are having to sleep on our streets. And those are two simple questions that I think I'm asked daily. I can't answer them. Could the Taoiseach of this country answer them?
Thanks, Count Corlett. Just in relation to the war in Ukraine, I think it's obvious that appeasement hasn't worked. I've stated my view on that and explained it earlier. Of course, Ireland argues for de-escalation, but de-escalation requires the aggressor to de-escalate. Ukraine was attacked. Ukraine is partially occupied. There can't be a de-escalation until the aggressor de-escalates. Ukraine can't de-escalate. Like what does that even look like? Does it mean Ukraine stopping the defence of its own cities, stopping the defence of its own citizens? So de-escalation has to involve the willingness of the aggressor to de-escalate. And we had a very good engagement with the UN Secretary-General in Brussels only last week, and teased out with him the point at which it might be appropriate for UN intervention, for example, an independent intervention into the war in Ukraine. And he was very clear that he wouldn't be calling for a ceasefire at this point in time, because he didn't think that that would be the right approach, given the current situation on the ground and Russia's victory or death position. That is the greatest difficulty, and I don't think President Putin cares how many million young Russians die in that war. I do think President Zelensky does care about how many Ukrainians die in that war, and he doesn't want to see Ukrainians left behind enemy lines, and he doesn't want to see the Ukrainian children who've been deported to Russia not returned. And that could happen in a ceasefire scenario, so all that needs to be borne in mind too. Just in relation to refurbishment, we've about 700 buildings we're using now at the moment to accommodate people from Ukraine and people from other parts of the world. And we weren't using those buildings this time last year, and we are refurbishing dozens, if not hundreds of more buildings. But they can't all be done at the same time, and there'll always be some building that's not refurbished. But 700 buildings refurbished, 80,000 people accommodated in the last year. It's been a Herculean effort, and I really want to thank everyone who's been involved in it. If we had amazing foresight 2 years ago, and we knew this war in Ukraine was going to happen, and we built a city the size of Waterford with 20,000 units in it, it would already be full. But that's what we've actually achieved. 700 different sites, 80,000 people accommodated in it, and we're going to refurbish more buildings and provide more in the year ahead. The rapid builds are approved. I think we've approved between 500 and 700 in the first phase of them, and they should be ready for occupation in the next few weeks. But as we've always learned in the past with modular and rapid build, it's not so cheap and not so rapid. As many of the advocates say, you have to have a site, you have to have the site serviced, it has to be ready, you can't just drop them in the field. You have to order them, then they have to arrive, and then you have to get them from the factory to the site and make sure there's no low bridges on the way, because then you can't even get them to the site. So as somebody who's been actively involved now in making modulars happen, and they are going to happen, they're not as rapid as people would hope they are, and that's just the reality of it. Just in relation to the teaching of education, I may need to come back to Deputy Barry with a more detailed reply on that. I'll have to speak to the Minister of Education on it. But what I would say is that there are 15,000 children and young people from Ukraine who've now been enrolled in 2,000 Irish schools. I really want to thank the teachers, the principals, the school boards, those school communities. They've been phenomenal, quite frankly. It's not a small thing to take in 15,000 children with very little English in most cases, welcome them into your school and integrate them in the way they have. And you know, I couldn't admire teachers and principals and school communities more for what they've done to respond to this crisis in the past year. As deputies will know, through RAILT, the regional education and language teams were doing the best possible to support children and young people from Ukraine. The teams work with schools, local educational assistance services and national assistance structures, and additional resources have been provided to RAILT for the enrolment of Ukrainian pupils, and additional RAILT resources have been appointed to areas under pressure. RAILT has also been extended to provide assistance to children under the Irish Refugee Protection Programme to find school places as well. In terms of capacity, which was raised by deputies, it is very tight in particular parts of the country, and we're continuously assessing the need for additional capacity in schools across the country. The RAILT teams, which I mentioned earlier, are currently developing an integrated approach to maximising utilisation of existing capacity for mainstream Ukrainian and special needs classes requirements, such as additional accommodation through school building projects and modular accommodation solutions. On English language provision in schools, there are 960 English and additional language posts. They've been allocated to just under 2,000 primary schools and post-primary schools who've enrolled children from Ukraine. There are 187 special education teachers, and 233 SNAs have also been allocated to schools to help with the response.
All right, I think we're going to have to move on, Taoiseach.